Hello, everyone. I'm going to start doing introductions. I can see the number of participants number flying up nice and high. I think today we've got over 200 registered. So let's see how many we actually have turning up today. What I'm going to do shortly is I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves and tell us why we're here. But first couple of minutes, I'm just going to run through how the webinar is going to run. So today it's 75 minutes. The topic is mental well-being and perfectionism. We've got three amazing speakers here today who are going to give you their views. We'd really like everybody to ask lots of questions. So please write questions in the Q&A box and we'll pick those up as we go along. We'll try to take questions as we go. We won't be waiting till the end. So please don't feel like you have to wait till the end to put your question in. We're going to have polls as well. So when we ask those polls, please try and answer them. They are completely and utterly anonymous. So nobody knows at all who's answering those polls. So please don't feel worried about that. But I think let's say welcome to everybody and let's start doing our introductions. So on my left, I have Sara Carnegie, who I've known for many years, and I've known Sara through her amazing work through the IBA. But Sara, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself today and why you're here?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me to join this fantastic panel and discussion today. I'm delighted. So my name's Sara, and I'm an employed barrister. I was in the criminal justice system for many, many years, working both within government and in a variety of roles, but certainly had an awareness at various stages of my career around mental health issues, mental well-being. It affected my colleagues, it affected me, and it was interesting to see how it was evolving in terms of its appreciation and understanding, both in the bar and within the civil service more broadly. So that's some of the background context. But within my role at the International Bar Association, I'm a legal director there, where I oversee a range of projects, including one of our largest and most important on mental well-being in the legal profession. So in that regard, we have recently launched our report, which was the findings of a global survey of both institutions and individuals. So over 3,000 participants and over 200 institutions. So looking at the mechanisms they have in place to support people, and then looking at what individuals' experiences are and how they are managing and coping and what the pressures and trigger points are for them. So those findings have been absolutely fascinating. And along the way, we've been assisted by a really dedicated global task force of both practitioners, experts, academics, and Liz Rimmer is one of them. So delighted to be here with her today. And of course, with Jeff, who's also been really supportive in our work at the International Bar Association. So that's my interest, and here to promote that work, raise awareness, and hopefully see some change.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sara. And again, all roads lead back to the IBA. I'm also on the task force, and it's a fantastic task force trying to change the mental well-being of the global legal sector. So no small feat there. We'll pass over to Jeff, and again, IBA wise, Jeff and I met at the IBA a few years back. Jeff was on a panel with me, and Jeff at the time was talking about vulnerability. He was a man talking about emotions. This was something very, very different, had the audience captured. And ever since then, Jeff and I have become very good friends. We spend a lot of time on the phone, on emails, chatting about mental well-being, what we can do. And Jeff has given his time to these webinars time and time again. So Jeff, why don't you give a full introduction of yourself?
Okay, sure. Thank you. And I did meet you a few years ago as a man talking about feelings, and I'm still a man talking about feelings. So I'm the Chief Legal and Corporate Affairs Officer of Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. It's a big pension fund that invests across 50 countries across the globe. I was an M&A lawyer. I was a deal lawyer at a Canadian law firm at the beginning of my career. And then I joined Ontario Teachers, and I managed about 100 individuals in our offices across the globe. But back when I was in private practice, I really wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be the best. And I really went through my academic career, and perfectionism was bred into me. And I went through kind of, all the trials and tribulations people do at a young age. But a few years into practice, I got divorced, and it really kind of rocked my world. It led me to kind of really reflect on what was going on in my life, because it was a huge failure. And I really felt a lot of shame about that. And this is how I got introduced to these concepts around perfectionism and vulnerability. As a result of that, I started kind of questioning a little bit, well, why was I so upset? Like, how can I get past this? And I got introduced to this concepts of vulnerability and shame and that relationship between perfectionism. And just learning about this stuff, it helped me really rediscover self-worth and courage and resilience. And it turned these concepts of perfectionism on their head for me and allowed me to take the idea of feeling vulnerable because I make a mistake or something went wrong into an energizing force. And I've used it at my work to transform, the ideas of being afraid of making mistakes into actually innovative in relationships with your individuals and your teams, being able to have more of a growth mindset. And I guess I'm here because I want to change the world for that younger Jeff Davis when I was a second year, where it was a hard life, kind of working in a law firm and working in this profession where we expect ourselves to be perfect, which is just unattainable and self-destructive. So that's why.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Jeff. And I think that's a really nice point, isn't it? That what we've all learned now, and how actually our younger selves, how we might have talked to our younger selves, how we might have looked after our younger selves better. And of course, without getting all therapy and counseling for everybody, we are still our younger selves, so we can talk to our younger selves at any time, heal those wounds. So I think that's a great thing for us all to keep in mind today. And Elizabeth, another lovely friend of mine who I've met through the legal sector, my days back to the Law Society, when you were running LawCare. And LawCare back then, Elizabeth, was much more about addiction and alcoholism, I think, if I remember rightly. And I think moving forward to where you are now, particularly post-lockdown, it's been much more about stress, and it's been much more about the younger generation of lawyers. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm Elizabeth Rimmer. I'm the Chief Executive at LawCare. We're a charity in the UK that support and promote mental health and wellbeing across the legal sector, all branches of the profession and all jurisdictions in the United Kingdom. And we also support people that work in non-legal roles within organizations. So you may be employed in the law, in HR or business services. We're also here to support you. We have been on a journey. We grew out of a concern in the early 90s around how much solicitors in England and Wales were drinking and using alcohol as a unhealthy coping mechanism for the pressures of life in the law. But since that time, we've expanded to move beyond that. I think probably because there's a better understanding now and more of a vocabulary around some of these concerns than perhaps there were back in the 90s, which actually I started my working life as a solicitor, and listening to Jeff speak about his early career. When I think about my younger self, one of the reasons I moved on from the law, and I don't often talk about this, but I was a clinical negligence solicitor. And this is in the early 90s. I left the law in 96 or 97. I found it incredibly difficult to cope with and know how to talk to people who'd had terrible things happen to them, because we acted for plaintiffs, now called claimants under our legal system. And, day in, day out, I was listening to stories of people whose children had been severely injured, or their husband had died on the operating table, and they come to see a lawyer because what they really wanted was an answer. They wanted to know why that had happened, and they wanted someone to say sorry. And actually what I found in the legal system, we were really about compensating people for loss, for financial loss. That's what litigation is about. And actually for most people, they never really, I felt, they weren't really getting what they wanted from the legal system. And I found that quite a challenge. And I also found it hard as a young person in my early 20s or mid 20s, not really knowing how to deal with this. And actually there was never any discussion about the emotional impact that the work may have on you. I don't think we do a good job of that now, but I think there's more recognition about that. And I think it's an important part of when we get into talking about mental health and well-being, that the work beyond the practices in law, but the impact, the emotional impact that practicing as a lawyer can have on you is something we often don't talk about enough, particularly if you work in areas of law with vulnerable people. So that was sort of my journey into law, and I moved on from that. But we're here to provide support but also aligning with what Sarah's been saying. A big part of what we want to do is start changing and working to improve that culture in law, so people are thriving and not just surviving.
Thank you very much. And I think that's such a valuable point as well, about particularly sort of that area of law and clinical negligence and others, where actually you are dealing with people and with loss, and actually as young solicitors coming into that profession and not having any support, and then going home and thinking about that, it's very, very hard. So I think certainly we need to find more support. So Elizabeth and Sarah, we've talked about the fact that the legal sector's in a mess, the global legal sector is in a mess. There's reports coming out all the time. They all say the same thing. They say that there's a crisis. So could you give us just the top lines of the reports that you've both been working on recently? Perhaps Sarah, you could start.
Yeah, I mean, my team covers a whole range of projects, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the key ones when I joined the IBA in 2019 was our work on bullying and sexual harassment. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the course of this event. But we were doing a global review on the prevalence of both bullying and sexual harassment in the legal workplace. And the figures that came out, which were across over 7,000 people responded, which in itself is pretty astounding for a survey. We all know that, particularly now, survey fatigue means you're lucky to get a handful. But at that point in time, we were pretty astonished at the sheer appetite for discussion on these issues. And it was absolutely staggering to see the number of people that were suffering from all manner of awful things that had gone on all over the world. It wasn't concentrated in particular jurisdictions, and it was happening across all parts of the profession, again, so not just in certain types of law firm. And we were seeing, 1 in 3 females had experienced sexual harassment and 1 in 14 men. Bullying, bit more of a spectrum, but certainly from the results we had, that was at 1 in 2 female and 1 in 3 men. So huge amounts of activity going on. A lot of this was recorded within the 12 months leading up to the survey. So we weren't just thinking about historic activity. And this was affecting people's well-being in the workplace. This was affecting their decisions about whether they were going to stay either at that workplace or even within the legal profession. So there were lots of consequences to this and things that we needed to address. And I can speak about that later. But what we then did in 2020 was to look at, to hone in on mental well-being in light of a range of things. COVID perhaps was some trigger, but hadn't been the sole reason for doing this. There'd been all interest, and the former president of the IBA was very interested in ABA results, so American Bar Association work that had been going on in this space. So we thought, let's do a global analysis of how people are faring. So we again conducted a survey. We looked at both individuals and institutions, and just some headline figures, because our report was published back on the 26th of October. But the headline figures, so 41% of people would not discuss mental well-being concerns with their employer for fear it would have a negative impact on their career. So that's a pretty extraordinary figure. And 1 in 3 said that their work has a negative or extremely negative effect on their well-being. So we gave a sort of a range of spectrum of answers in terms of impact. The other really interesting point before I hand over to Elizabeth was the World Health Organization Index of Well-being. Now, this is a scale which allows comparisons across groups, regions, and it's well known, it's well used. It wasn't unique for us to use it. And for an individual, a score below 52 is an indicator of mental health concerns that would warrant intervention. So that means medication, therapy, some sort of serious intervention. We found in our average score of respondents that 51 was the score that was coming through. So that's a real concern, that our legal professionals globally are on average scoring below the point at which intervention is recommended.
Gosh, so they're quite stark figures, aren't they? And there's obviously clearly a lot of, and hopefully what we can talk about today is actually what we can do, because the figures keep coming out. And the figures are not just static, the figures are constantly getting worse. And obviously we've all lived through a pandemic. That's a huge impact on people personally and professionally as well. And Elizabeth, what kind of figures are you seeing then?
So we, like the IBA, we have done a study just in the UK of legal professionals. We published our work at the end of September, and it's called Life in the Law. And if you want to read it in detail, it's on our website. You don't have to read all 93 pages. We have a short infographic and a video that also explains the key findings. What we wanted to look at was how the culture and practice of law impacts mental well-being. What is it about working practices in the law that are having an impact? We had just over 1,700 legal professionals complete our survey. And our key findings very much chime with the results from the IBA work, and they add to a growing body of evidence from other jurisdictions as well, like the ABA in 2016 did a very large study in the US, and in the UK, the Junior Lawyers Division of the Law Society in England and Wales, they've done 3 pieces of research as well on the impact of junior lawyers and mental health. You know, what we're seeing globally is it's common findings across jurisdictions that we have some mental well-being challenges in the law. And before I go on to talking about the findings, just picking up on something that you said, Melissa, you know, we're talking about this a lot. We're putting out lots of reports and evidence. It's really incumbent on us now that we start changing all this data into a call for action and we actually do something about it. So our findings were, not surprisingly, that legal professionals are under strain. Something that we looked at, 3 areas. We looked at burnout, psychological safety, and autonomy. Just talking about the burnout, what we found is across all respondents to our survey, legal professionals are a high risk of burnout. So we used a recognized burnout scale where the cutoff point for being at risk of burnout is about 34. Our sample scored 42. So we're way above that. We're at the other end of the scale. And where lawyers and legal professionals scored particularly highly on that scale was on the exhaustion element. So people are tired, and that relates to, we also looked at work intensity, that tight deadlines, that sense of needing to respond to clients, that sense of overwhelm, being reactive. All of those things are contributing to that. We also found that those working practices undermine mental health and well-being. Along similar lines to what the IBA did, we found that there's generally a lack of management training for people in the law who are supervising others. When we asked people what they found the most valuable well-being support in the workplace, they said it was an opportunity for a regular catch-up and a check-in with someone else above anything else. We looked at the impact of COVID, not surprising, number of learnings from that. And interestingly, 2 other things to make. One, very much a sense that this is a collective responsibility. It's not one individual organization's concern. It's something that concerns all of us, and it concerns legal educators and regulators as well. But something also I think worth remembering is stigma is still a big challenge. Even though we've got greater awareness and engagement around mental health and we're talking about it more, fundamentally, it's still really hard for legal professionals, you know, to put their hand up and say they're struggling. So we still have a lot of work to do on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I think that's really interesting that, you know, often if there's a takeaway from day, and there was one so far, you know, managers having check-ins, having one-to-ones with their teams. It sounds so simple, but I guess what happens in many businesses is that actually those one-to-ones get nudged, and then they get nudged the next day, and then it's, oh well, we've missed this week, let's catch up next week. So if one thing that if there are leaders on the call today, perhaps that's one thing. If you've got one-to-ones in with your teams, try and keep them in. And burnout. So burnout is effectively that defense against intolerable pressure. So there's pressure coming in there, and that burnout scale is so high. It's actually over the average. So perhaps, Jeff, you know, what are you seeing as a client of legal services and working with lawyers every day? What are you seeing?
Sure. I'm seeing a lot of the things that Elizabeth is referring to, both internally with the lawyers within my teams, but also externally. And I think the statistics are really important and telling. You know, I've studied a lot about perfectionism, and I'd say there was a study done this past year on how positively correlated burnout is to people who have a perfectionist mindset. So it's more amplified there, which I suspect might be part of what's going on there, Elizabeth. I don't want to start interpreting data without looking at it, but what I think is going on is that we've grown up in work environments that really celebrated this idea of being the star, the genius, the perfectionist, like getting everything right. And I never loved making mistakes. I hated making mistakes. I was taught to like feel them and get angry, and they hurt almost. But it even got to the extent where through success, I think that somehow we realize that as a result of a success, we expect that others might not want us to make mistakes. Like we almost feel like a pressure to always be perfect. I think this is why I talk about vulnerability, because in a culture that creates a vulnerable environment, it's basically premised on the idea that you're imperfect and you will make mistakes. Not that you might, but you will. And it allows you to be more open when you do, that it's not a shocking life, kind of like, I'm a terrible person, I'm not a smart person. It's actually just a very normal thing. You can openly admit them, you can fix them faster. And also when you're freed from the need to be perfect, you're free to experiment. In my company, I've seen if you create an environment that is open around these kind of concepts, it creates a culture where anyone can speak up and challenge the boss and take ownership. And a culture of perfectionism, that doesn't happen because the risk of a new idea or challenging the leader isn't worth the pain of rejection or looking dumb. I've seen this happen. My team challenges me all the time, all the time. Sometimes I wish that it wasn't all the time, but they do. And I know why we do it is because we created this culture and they feel supported in it. And I know intuitively, I think we're attracted to leaders that encourage openness and collaboration. Our stories of heroes are these vulnerable heroes at the end of the day. And I think we crave authenticity and humility and openness and people in power. So we too can be open about our imperfections. I'll say a couple more things about perfectionism though, because that's where you started, is it is a killer. There's no question about that. It's something we were taught to answer the interview question, is your greatest weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist. That's me, because we thought it was we perceived it as a strength. But it's a personality trait. It's a dangerous one. It spreads by irresponsible role modeling, by impossible demands, and through the use of social media. They can test for it, thanks to a couple of Canadians. And there's 3 different types of perfectionism. They categorize them as self-oriented. So the one you say, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not paid well enough. There's other-oriented, where you hold other people out to unreasonable standards of perfection. But the one that is really surfaced in society and is metastasizing the fastest is what they call socially oriented perfectionism. And this is where the culture or the business feels like they need to be perfect. It shows up where we hide or overact mistakes, when we accept impossible deadlines, and when we place them on ourselves. It's fueled by social media and instantaneous communication. And I think that if we understood that burnout is highly correlated to anxiety disorders, eating disorders, depression, burnout, suicide ideation, like it gets dark. It's really terrible things, that the fact that we put ourselves in this position, it can be so much more liberating and freeing and healthy if you just kind of push your perfected self out of your own way and start to live your life in a way like, I am awesome, I think I'm smart, I'm good, and well, yeah, I make mistakes from time to time, but still, that doesn't mean I'm not worthy of the recognition and the accolades that I receive. I don't know if that gets at the question you're asking.
It does, and I think it's really this whole idea about being perfect. And I agree, didn't we all say that, when we were asked in interviews, it was, oh, we were just too perfect with that. And it was like the classic answer to a question, but I just do things far too well, and that's kind of a weakness of mine. Whereas actually we look at that, and we look at the sector, and we look at the personality types that come into the sector, that whole idea of, I guess, accepting and saying, oh yes, perhaps this week I don't feel perfect because I'm feeling quite anxious, or I'm feeling quite sad, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or actually I'm checking in with myself and I'm nearing burnout, but I can't do anything about it. I need to keep going, and I cannot show anyone that I might be. So I must show that I'm perfect. And I think that's a good time for us to have a poll with the audience now to actually ask them how they're feeling. So it's a very quick question, hopefully a very easy one for you to answer. Have you ever had a phase where your work has adversely affected your mental health? That includes anxiety, feeling depressed, overwhelmed, burnout. 3 answers: yes, no. It's a yes, I have, but I wouldn't want to admit it within my professional life. So we'll give that a few more seconds. Okay, and I think we'll go to close the poll now. So if we can share those results. Okay, so we've got yes, 88%, no, 4% of our audience, and yes, but I wouldn't want to admit it, as 8%. So effectively, I'm going to do the maths here, we have 96% saying yes to the fact that their work. So can I come back to the panel now and ask, are you surprised with those results? I mean, is it a surprise? Because effectively, people who have turned up today, people who've taken 75 minutes out of their day, you would think are people who are either aware of a need for self-care, they've taken that 75 minutes, and or it's people who are actively seeking help. So personally, for me, I'm not surprised that it's that high, but I'd like to ask the rest of the panel.
I mean, I'd ask Sarah, like I'm not surprised at the 96% number. What I'm surprised at, and I'm encouraged by, is the 88% number that they're comfortable talking about it in the workplace.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
That was the bit I was also going to really flag, that doesn't completely align with the findings that we saw. And I think maybe Elizabeth, yours would be the same in terms of your domestic responses. We were seeing that, 1 in 3 were afraid of being treated differently as a consequence of any form of revelation around vulnerability, and that they had a different perception as to the authenticity of their employers' efforts in this space. So you'd see a real disconnect between the institutional belief in the fact they were prioritizing this versus the individual perception, which was, well, whatever lip service is being paid to this, I don't feel like it's really going to change anything, or that it's meaningful and it will get at the underlying root causes. So there's an interesting disparity there. So I mean, it's great to see if people have been able to raise it and feel supported, and that's a positive sign, but it is surprising.
And we had, in our research, actually it was a better statistic than we were expecting. We found 56% of people had said they had spoken about their mental health concerns in the workplace, and we thought it would be lower than that. And we wondered whether, if we had run our survey 3 years ago, or not during a pandemic, would that result have been different? So I think it's encouraging to see that high number in the response today to the poll, but we were also encouraged by our statistic, although it's not 80 or 90%, it's more than half. And we will be rerunning our research probably in 3 years' time, and it will be really interesting to see if that number changes. And I think what we've just seen in the poll reflects the fact that we're all humans, and we all have experiences. We have physical health and mental health, and we are all likely at some point in our lives to have difficult times where our mental health will impact us in the workplace as well.
Yeah, and I think let's how about our next poll, actually, which is a very, very easy one. Let's see how many perfectionists we've got in the audience today. Would you class yourself as a perfectionist? Yes or no? Let's give this one another 10 seconds. Hopefully this is an even easier one. And just to say as well, on the last poll, we had about 75% of the audience answering that poll today. I think we've got fewer than that answering today, but we've still got 65% classing themselves as a perfectionist, 35% saying that they didn't think that. So if we're talking about coming back to perfectionism, Jeff, And something that you and I have talked about often is about maladaptive coping mechanisms, and
Sure.
how that leads into perfectionism and coping tendencies. And we know as a sector, and Elizabeth talked about it, and the whole reason that LawCare was set up was around addiction. And back then it was addiction around alcohol. And I think if everybody was honest with themselves, everybody has some sort of addiction. For me, I'm pretty sure I'm probably addicted to my mobile phone. I have a daughter who's obsessed with Peppa Pig, so she often takes my phone and is watching Peppa Pig. And apologies, that's technology. That's the mobile phone ringing in the middle of a webinar. It's very, very cool. But it wasn't Peppa Pig, at least. And I know that in those times it might only be 5 minutes, but I'm perhaps panicking about what email might be coming through, or have I missed a WhatsApp, and I need to check. And I'm often being told last thing before, could you just put your phone down? And the first thing in the morning, could you just put your phone down? So I think that whole thing around addiction has changed, and it's no longer just the traditional types of addiction. But perhaps, Jeff, you could talk about that, and talked about maladaptive tendencies and how they.
Sure. Sure. I'll there's a lot of them. There's a lot of that classifies as maladaptive coping techniques or mechanisms, but I'll talk about a few of them. And one of them I think we all kind of know about is that is substance abuse, so alcohol or drugs. And it really, with all of them, is you're dealing with an emotional state, something that you're feeling, something that you're struggling with, and you want to distract yourself from it. There's healthy ways to do that. There's actually some ways you don't even need to distract with that, and I'll get to that towards the end of the question or comments. But what we do is, alcohol can be a good escape. It can distract you from that very difficult day. Your boss saying something to you that really hurt and struck you and really made you kind of rock your world. And even the next day you wake up, and a phone can be a great way to distract yourself from those thoughts and going like, why did he say that? I'm still upset about it. Another one, rumination, the kind of cycling through, like, why did he say that? What's going on? Like kind of really spinning something from a comment. I remember my boss first, a year and a half ago, he joined as the CEO. And, I've been at the organization through a few CEOs, and he joined and he said, I'm not sure I get this vulnerability stuff. And I kind of was like, oh no, like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Because my whole world's about this stuff, and how we can ever relate. And I kind of built it in this story. It's like, well, he just hates this stuff and he sees it as weakness, and I see it as courage, and you won't understand, until I sat down and said, so what did you mean? And he's like, well, no, I just want to understand this more. I didn't understand. Like that's kind of a version of rumination where you really spin something into a much bigger story. Another version of a maladaptive coping mechanism is about blame and anger. So sometimes when you have that difficult situation or struggle, it can be so much easier to cause pain to other people than to experience your own pain. I heard someone recently say it's easier to transmit pain than it is to transform it. And so you get outbursts and upset at other people. You're working your stuff out on other people as a result of what you're feeling. Those are maladaptive coping mechanisms. I think more adaptive ones take courage. They take a willingness to be curious about, okay, why am I feeling this way? What's going on? Like, this feels really strong. And ask yourself those questions. Actually just recognize it. Rather than pick up your phone, just go like, I'm really upset, and stay with that for a moment and go like, hey, what's going on? Why am I so upset? It feels different. And then start to challenge, what's the story I'm telling myself? Why am I getting so upset? Why is this? Am I about to get fired, or am I about to die? Or is it just actually someone said a comment that's wound me up so much? Because I think one thing we do is that we end up taking a comment that is difficult, and then we tell ourselves a story that relates to some larger image or concern or anxiety or insecurity we have about ourselves, and build that into the narrative of that comment fits this negative self-talk that I have about myself, and we make it much more strong and powerful. So an adaptive way to deal with that is to challenge the stories that you're telling yourself. In my team, I have team members saying when they're upset, they say, okay, they'll stop and they'll say, okay, the story I'm telling myself right now is this. And like, it's just a cue. It's like, okay, I understand what's going on. You're having a hard time right now. And let's talk about that and work out through that. Well, that's not what I meant, and that's not what I said, and that's not why. Tell me more. And I think that if we can kind of challenge our own thinking, we can actually come out of those situations feeling much more resilient and much stronger than you will by drinking to kind of just get away from it, or distracting yourself with a phone. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, yeah, no, it does. And I think that's it. And I think we all have tendencies to do that and to have a narrative, to go down the narrative. And I think the other thing that a lot of us do as well is it's much easier to look at other people's narrative. So for example, going on social media, scrolling through Twitter, when you're not looking at your own narrative at that point, you're looking at everyone else's and what's everybody doing. And, oh, look, they're doing this, they're happy, they're sad, they're whatever. But the last thing that you're doing at that point is looking inward and looking at yourself and wondering exactly how you feel. And I've listened to some really good podcasts recently from Ranjan Chatterjee, and he was saying that, and he was saying, just spend 2 minutes of every day where you don't have your phone, you don't have everything, you literally check in with yourself, and you can pick any time of the day for that, and you just check in and you say, how am I feeling? How am I doing? And just in that 2 minutes, you can actually say, gosh, actually today I'm feeling really stressed, so I need to do something different, or actually I feel in a different way. And it was a very, very positive podcast, and I'll send it to anyone afterwards if anybody wants to know what it was called. But it was very useful to do that and actually run your own narrative. But of course, trying to run your own narrative in a really positive way, I think is really important. So thank you for that. But Elizabeth or Sarah, did you have anything to say on that?
I don't mind. Elizabeth, you go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to, listening to what Jeff was saying, I think when we think of this in the professional context, we're not taught during our legal education about our emotions and how to understand them and how they relate to the workplace. Our minds are trained to be rational legal thinkers, and we're trained to sort of park our emotions at the door, because if we allow them to come in, somehow that's going to cloud our ability to analyze and reason. And of course, we can't divorce ourselves from our emotions. We're human beings. And I think understanding our feelings, our angers, our frustrations, what we're experiencing in the moment, perhaps when we've had a difficult interaction with a client or with another colleague, and understanding what that's doing to us is really important. And we, just giving a plug for something that we've done at LawCare, we've developed an online training resource that's free with the Open University called Fit for Law. You can access it via our website, and the whole thing takes about 3 or 4 hours, but you can do it in short chunks. And it was done with focus groups of legal professionals, and it's all about helping lawyers to understand their emotions. And we are bringing out phase 2, probably by the summer of next year, which is going to be around how we work with others and understanding our relationships in the workplace and how to handle that. Because I think, and maybe it goes further back, that generally I think our emotional literacy, we have to learn that ourselves. We're often not taught those kinds of things in school either, yet we all know why we need to eat a healthy diet and take lots of exercise, but we don't do much about understanding our own psychology. And I think that if we had a better understanding of that, it can help you put things in context and take that moment to take a step back and think, this is what's going on here. I'm reacting this way because this is how I feel. And have that vocabulary to articulate it is really important.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I wonder if we could go to, we've got another poll here for everyone, just checking that everyone's still awake. So if you could launch the next poll, which is actually asking the audience about your maladaptive coping mechanisms, how often you use them. So when you're not feeling great, how often are you reaching for the phone, or perhaps having one too many glasses of wine, or burying yourself even further in work, which is something that we hear of, which happens quite a lot. So I can see that the numbers for some of the time are coming in quite high, and most of the time as well. So we'll give it a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to finish that. I think that
Elizabeth, what you said about emotions and feelings, it reminded me, there's a funny line in that television show Ted Lasso where Roy Kent says something along the lines, he yells, he's really upset, and he says, like, I can't control my feelings. And then Ted Lasso says, then by all means, let them control you. Like, it's just kind of, I think you're right about emotional literacy and being able to kind of start to manage them.
Yeah.
I
Sorry,
was just going to add in there, because I think that this is, I mean, all in really, really important points, completely agree. But one thing that distinguishes the reactions are different aspects of characters involved. So the intersectionalities that we see coming through. So I think rather than assuming there's one set way of dealing with this, or one approach to creating better resilience or understanding of one's feelings, is probably obviously not going to work. And that's sometimes, I think, things that the workplace needs to do better, understanding that those issues that affect different gender, different parts of society, people with all sorts of particular characteristics, that needs to be addressed. Because another thing that was found in our work, both bullying and harassment and in the mental wellbeing work, was that these issues are often resulting in people who are defined with a specific characteristic suffering more at work and in the workplace. It's adding to their turmoil and difficulty. So, we found younger, female, ethnic minority, and legal professionals with disabilities have been disproportionately impacted. So whatever solutions are being found need to be a little bit more nuanced.
And just adding to that, we also looked at intersectionality and exactly the same findings that Sarah's just described. And we're actually at the moment running a series of roundtables with our stakeholders on our life in the law research. And this morning we had a roundtable with special interest groups in the law that represent lawyers with disabilities, Black lawyers, Asian lawyers, women, LGBT+. And what really came through from that was this sense of people feeling they have to pretend to be something that they're not and fit into a mold in order to be successful in the law, and how excluding some of those working practices can be of people with certain characteristics, and that we really need to ensure, particularly in the post-COVID world now that we're in, where at least there's greater flexibility in working practices, but be very conscious that a lot of people are pretending to be something that they're not sometimes not pretending, but don't feel able to be themselves in the workplace because they feel they have to conform to what is seen as the ideal. And I think that also feeds into the discussion around perfectionism. And that's an added strain for many people within our profession.
Yeah, I think we hear a lot, don't we, that people say that they don't feel comfortable about bringing their whole self to work. Yeah. So actually they have to leave part of themselves, and that's not congruent to feeling good mental health is being you and being able to be comfortable to you. And as Jeff has talked about, being able to be vulnerable, being able to say who you are, who sort of is the real person. I often do it, I have a child with special needs. So Jessica takes up a huge amount of my time and my life. It wouldn't be congruent of me to spend time with clients, getting to know new clients, and not mention anything about that aspect of my life. And the same goes for them. And people might have parents that are ill, they might have children that might have all sorts of things. And actually, if that's just left at home, and I think one good thing that came out of COVID was because we were all in our homes, all of a sudden we became more than that person who's just at the desk doing the work. We actually became a person who was at home, and someone might run in, or we might say we have to leave because we're a carer and we have to go and do something. So I think that was all a real positive around that. So I think there are some good things there, but I can see we've actually got some questions, and I'm just going to have a quick look through those. We've got a question there about imposter syndrome, and I guess, Elizabeth, that's what you were really sort of getting to there. So I think let's pick up some more on that. Thank you for being open and authentic selves. That's brilliant. People on this webinar are a self-selecting group able to talk about this. I wonder how many junior lawyers are on here. Well, actually, I can say this because I've looked through the list. 200 signed up. We actually had a good mix of managing partners. I've seen people in marketing teams from different law firms who've signed up as well. And I have seen some junior lawyers as well. So there was a really good mix, and actually from over 25 different jurisdictions as well. We've had somebody saying, I think we're more comfortable sharing with certain people within the workplace, but that we're struggling with mental health at work, not great at putting in measures to support to change this, recognise the issue, but not helped by employers or leaders to make positive changes. somebody suggesting that we need a perfectionist, well, we needed a third category. Somebody classes themselves as a recovering perfectionist. Once they became aware of perfectionism and the terrible effects it was having on them, especially on working life, started working on addressing that, catching themselves in unrealistic expectations of themselves and accepting that good enough is exactly that. We'll go through a few more in a minute. So let's come back to Elizabeth. Let's come back to, it was Chris's point about imposter syndrome. So let's talk a bit more about that, because that's about pretending that you're, or needing to be something that you're not, leaving a part of yourself at home. What have you seen, particularly with regards to addiction, and how perhaps imposter syndrome might lead to different forms of addiction?
Well, we've put out quite a lot of information and blogs around imposter syndrome, which is a common phenomena in the law, alongside another term, which is insecure overachievers. And I think it's this, with imposter syndrome, it may not only, it's not perhaps just about that sense of wanting to fit in, it's actually a sense of feeling I'm not good enough to be here. They're going to find out at some point that actually I'm not all of these things that they think I am. And I think that causes people to feel extremely anxious, and then means that perhaps you fall into some of those unhealthy working patterns, because you're constantly striving to prove that you deserve to be where you're at. So we've got quite a lot of information about that on our website. In terms of, addiction, I'm not an expert, and I think at LawCare, although we had our roots in alcohol, I think it was very much viewed along the lines of what Jeff was saying around maladaptive coping mechanisms. It's an unhealthy coping mechanism. That sense of, alcohol is a drug of choice, I think, for many people, because it's legal, it's widely available, it's socially acceptable. And depending on the culture that you live in, but certainly in British culture, although that is changing, there's been an accepted pattern of behavior that we celebrate life's ups and downs and difficult times with alcohol. And so that sense of coming in from a really long day and a hard day, and you think, oh, I'll just have that glass of wine or that whiskey and soda or whatever it is to sort of help me unwind. And that can then lead into a dependency. I don't think, anecdotally, although we don't get many calls about alcohol dependency anymore, we still think it's a significant concern in the legal sector. And that although there's greater moves now around recognizing culturally and socially, particularly younger generations, less younger people are drinking alcohol than in, say, compared to my generation did back in the 80s. There's a sort of societal shift taking place for lots of reasons, and also for more inclusive workplaces, that for people who don't drink alcohol for whatever reason, a lot of those practices in accepted working culture in the law can be extremely excluding of people who don't drink. And so you're beginning to see on the fringes more alcohol-free events. Also, when we talk about harassment and bullying and some of those poor behaviors, some of that has been fueled by alcohol events where it's been freely available and has led to poor choices. So I think there's lots within this. And, I think there's also an aspect of, if, addiction, I guess, is really about, it's sort of about behavior where you are getting stimulus that you find rewarding and you're prepared to do it no matter what the consequences. I mean, that's really what true addiction is, I guess. And that can obviously take a myriad of forms. And another area that we put out information and have had quite a lot of calls over the years is around gambling, another area of concern. And then I think when we talk about our phones, every time we see a little like, or somebody's commented on something that we've put on LinkedIn, we get that little hit in our brain that says, oh, people like us, this is rewarding. That's why I need to keep checking. So I think it's all around those strategies that perhaps people have evolved that are unhealthy to help them manage the pressure. And that now we're shifting that discussion to actually helping people see there are lots of healthier ways of managing some of these pressures. And once you understand that, then you can proactively take those steps to do the things that support your mental well-being, and not reach for the wine or the Domino's pizza, or not go to the gym because you're too busy. Is actually think, I need to prioritize these healthy habits that I have. I need to prioritize spending time with my friends and family. These are the things that actually support my mental health, and not sacrifice them to that sense of work is more important than all of these other things. And I think that's where we really need to start shifting that conversation. And I think it's beginning to happen.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think we've talked a lot about sort of the negative coping tendencies, and we've talked a lot about culture, but what about, you know, the positive ones, and how do we, and there are a lot of firms out there creating much more empathetic cultures, that we do have leaders like Jeff being vulnerable. And we know that Jeff, obviously you go and you give talks often. You're going in and giving a big talk tomorrow to a big group of GCs again about vulnerability. So actually shifting that, and actually people being able to talk more about emotions. One thing that I do is I took it from The Artist's Way, which is a book about for artists, but actually it's called Pages. And effectively what I try to do, and I don't do it every day, but it's effectively get out a notebook, and for 5 minutes just write any words that I think of. Now these words, obviously I'll bleep them out, but they might be swear words, they might be words about anything and everything, but effectively, and then you look at it and you look at that's your state of mind right now. There's all that stuff. And so instead of then perhaps 2 hours later, I'm with a team member, I'm with someone, and instead of me snapping at them, I've already got that emotion out. I've done that. So it's actually that checking in with myself. And I'm hearing more and more people talking about doing those kind of things. We know we've got Chris Owen, who's a great friend of ours through the IBA, and he's really trying to bring mindfulness. And whenever we're having our committee meetings, you know, we'll start with a mindfulness practice for 5 minutes. And it's bringing lots of those things, I think, into a sector where it's been uncomfortable before, whereas now it's changing that to move it away from the negative. But Jeff, I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that, look, I think that using the kind of techniques that if you were go to a doctor and they say, try this mindfulness stuff out, and try, meditation, try journaling. I'd say my first reaction when someone suggested to me, he's like, no, that doesn't work for me. I'm not that guy who cultures his own kombucha, and like, it doesn't work for me. But I'll say this, there's a science behind it. And if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, okay, you broke your leg, you need a cast, you got to have it on for 4 weeks, you're going to say, okay. Or if you go to the doctor and says, you got this infection, you need to take this antibiotic, you say, okay. Most doctors will tell you now, if you practice mindfulness, if you do 3 minutes of meditation a day, that is going to improve your life. But we're kind of like, well, that's just weird. And it's like, but all the medical professionals are actually saying doing that. Beyond that, probably most medical professionals would say, if you have access to therapy, use it. Like, it's the same thing. It's like if you have a free trainer at the gym to help you with your physical health, if you have access to a trainer to help you on therapy, use that stuff. There was a question in there, though, I think it's important to get at, because I've been asked this before. It really says, okay, it's great to have a leader talking about vulnerability because you're at a certain level and it's so fine and well for you to get up and go, I'm vulnerable. But what about if you're a junior lawyer? What if you're not at that level in the organization? What do you say to that person? And I want to answer that because I think it's important. I'd say it's a matter of choices. And if you actually choose to armor up or hide yourself or not show yourself, you are having consequences as a result of that. And I've experienced that. And I see it in team members too. It's shame at the end of the day. If you can't show part of yourself, part of your weakness, whatever it is, your vulnerability, if you can't be open about that, it's going to come with the price of shame. And that leads to negative self-worth. That leads to some of the issues that we're talking about here. So it's not like, what I would say to the junior lawyer is get there quicker. Start to learn about this now and apply it. Don't wait for years to come to this realization that I've been treating myself poorly the whole time, and I got to do all this work to get myself out of these problems and this negative way of thinking. I say the quicker you can get at it, it's smarter. I know it might feel weird, because if you're in a culture of perfectionism, if you're standing up and said, well, I messed that up, I'd say boundaries are important. I'm not suggesting you get up in a team meeting and reveal your deepest, darkest secret to everybody and just kind of like that. You got to meet people with the appropriate discretion. I'm just saying you need to accept that you are imperfect. You need to find places to be able to share who your true self is in order to feel really seen. If you can't do that, you're not going to perform at your best. It's just not possible. You'll have too much emotional energy trying to hide who you are and getting in the way of your thinking and come with anxiety. So it's a long answer, but I think it's better to get at it sooner and go buy a book and read about it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jeff. And I think we've still got some questions coming through, which is great that everybody we've still been asked about imposter syndrome, and actually there's a question here about why women in particular are being signposted to being an imposter syndrome sufferer, but actually it's not that those people are imposters, but more so that the culture that they're working in has made them feel that way. So I think we've got something about culture there. Somebody's asking about the panel, do we think that law firm leaders generally need for their own self-care and to increase their own self-awareness before they can help others? Andrea says, if we're offered a doctor to treat us who is suffering from mental ill health, burnout, substance abuse, etc., would we question their ability to treat us competently, refuse treatment, ask for another doctor? Yes, we would. Yet law firms are offering up to their clients lawyers who are feeling exactly the same way. And we get this a lot. So we do a lot of client listening, and we talk to clients of law firms, people like Jeff. And in fact, we're doing a paper at the moment of which Jeff is being interviewed, which talks exactly about that. What are the behaviors? What do you look for in your clients? And we often talk to them, and they'll say, yes, that lawyer is fantastic, but I do worry about them a bit because they seem to work 24 hours a day. And, they are always replying to me immediately. And of course, that's a very difficult position to be in as a lawyer, and particularly a junior lawyer, that a client has sent you and you think you've done the right thing by replying to them at 11 p.m. But actually the client's thinking, why have you replied to me at 11? And I know that a lot more law firms are trying to say to their teams, actually, unless it's absolutely urgent, and in fact, why are you checking your emails at 11 o'clock at night? Get back to them the following morning. Or we talk to our teams and we ask our teams to schedule emails, because for whatever reason they might be working in the evening, but we ask them to schedule emails so that they go at 8 o'clock the next morning. So there's lots of different things that can be done there. But can I come back to the panel about all of the comments and questions that have been coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say something about leadership here, because I do think that this is absolutely critical to creating the right working atmosphere. And I realise that that's going to be different depending on, the size of the firm and the visibility of the leaders. But I still believe, at various points of leadership level within the biggest of these firms, where perhaps arguably some of the more tricky conditions may exist in terms of practice hours and pressure at the junior end in particular. I think that what I've been hearing, and to some extent anecdotal, but supported by the evidence that we've seen, is that many leaders, whilst ostensibly sympathetic, have also felt inside themselves, I did this, I managed to get through this, and I've got the kind of badge at the end of it. So effectively kind of get on with it, toughen up a bit. I mean, that's obviously a big generalization, but I do think that exists. It certainly existed at the bar. It's certainly, from my experience of having been there was a real sense of you've got to earn your colors here. And actually, if people still have that inside them, and even if it's subconscious, they may be playing to the right field in terms of the policies that can be kind of put out there to show that they're not ignoring the issue. But is it really reaching the employees? Is your junior lawyer really going to be able to say, if everyone else in the team is working hard, well, actually, I'm now burnt out at 7:30 at night and I want to be able to have an evening, when they know full well that in order to be taken on at the end of their traineeship, there's a whole load of people that are just going to be let go. So I think you've got a 2-year period of exceptional vulnerability when you're in a training contract situation. Yeah. And then I think on your march towards being a partner, which ultimately perfectionists will all kind of hope and dream of, they're there for a reason. And some will get out and think this isn't for me. And, I know lots of people who've done that, but others are desperately trying to ensure that they are seen to be really dedicated to what they do, and then want to see that model replicated in those that are coming up behind them. So this is a real human condition as well as a structural work environment condition.
And how do we change that then? Because we're hearing that there's fewer people wanting to come into the profession. There's people wanting to leave the profession. This is before pandemic as well. So if actually, this is what younger people in generations have to look forward to, is actually having a horrific time at the beginning of their career. We know that, for a lot of lawyers, in their early 30s, there's a lot of marriage breakdown because of the fact of how hard they're working. You hear of people being put on planes kind of 4 times a week. They're seeing their families. I remember working with a client, and it was a young female partner, and I think her daughter was about 2, and she was away 5 days in 7. Repeatedly, and not long after, about 12 months after, she moved firms. Now I don't know, but I'm going to make a guess that might have been part of the reason behind that. So, but it's that culture, isn't it? That culture of working as hard as we possibly can, everybody working as many hours as they possibly can. So if we come back to you again, Jeff, as a client of law firms, what is it that you look for? So if you're working with a client and it appears that this firm's culture perhaps wasn't the culture you thought it was when they came and pitched to you, and actually these lawyers are all burnt out, what do you do? I mean, do you find that? What do you do in those situations?
I've done a number of things. I usually, most firms, there's a relationship managing partner that I have a relationship with, and I usually try to burrow into that relationship, like really get to know them and talk about the ideas that I'm talking about right here, and find opportunity to talk about the people who work on teachers teams at those firms about these ideas here. I think that, I've spoken openly about some parts of their models that I don't agree with, like what Sara was talking about, that we called it hire back in Canada, where the first year you're kind of on conditionally hired. Like that's psychological conditioning. That's terrible, right? And I don't know many jobs where, you get hired, but you might not keep your job for an entire year. And, a number of people who are hired alongside you are going to get fired. I think that's a terrible way of running a company. And I know that we use a lot of firms that do that, but I'm definitely going to continue with saying that openly. I think that when I see lawyers who say, you can call me on vacation, don't worry, I'm here to do anything for you, I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, you need to, if you're doing that, that means your whole teams are going to see and expect that they need to do that too. And then I'm going to be dealing with a bunch of people who are totally burnt out and living. I don't want to work with a firm that has a culture like that. So being explicit about those things, but I'm not going to disown it entirely. I was on a call 2 nights ago with the general counsel of a very large pension fund. And he was telling me how impressed he was with this law firm, because one of the lawyers was working on her daughter's birthday. It was 11 p.m. at night. And then she was willing to spend hours and kind of just not get distracted by the birthday party that's going on, be working on the file. And he was like so impressed with that, what she was doing. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, when did that, like, do you remember being in private practice? Like, this is the problem. So I can't say that, I think we all need to change behavior. I think clients need to change behavior as well as the law firms. I can't say this is, the law firms got to figure it out. That type of attitude, I'm sure, exists a lot of places with people who hire for legal services.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it when I've worked with clients, and there'll be perhaps the clash of holidays, and one person, it's usually the most junior, will say, "Oh, don't worry, I'll work through my holiday then," and the more senior person says, "Great, thanks for that." And I'm often shocked at that, thinking, whoa, that's just so not all right, and it's still happening. So it's how do we change that? But that culture has to come from the top. So if the managing partner of the firm, if your line manager goes on holiday and is picking up emails throughout, I have to say, I will admit it. I was one of those dreadful people that went on holiday and worked throughout my entire holidays. And I had a bit of a wake-up call during lockdown that actually, when I thought there may never be a holiday ever again, that was my last holiday I'd ever been on. And also, you know, having a child with special needs is a very different holiday. So now I have an out of office which says I am on holiday. If it is absolutely urgent, yes, of course, please WhatsApp me. But I have an amazing team, and all of these people can help you. And also, what that does is it instills confidence in my team that actually they can answer things. They feel like they're in control, not that they have to be managed even when I'm away on holiday and I can't trust them to do anything. So it's actually a lot of positives. But we've got a final poll, because we've got 10 minutes left, and our final poll is actually asking, if you were to start your career again and having the experience that you've had, would you choose law again? So I hope we haven't put everybody off. Let's have a look. It's coming up. Okay, so we've got the people that have answered, 20, over a quarter of people have said yes, they would. 34% of people said no, and 40% maybe. So that's not an amazing recommendation for people to go into the law. One of the other questions, we've had a few questions come through around the topic that we talked about right at the beginning, actually, around bullying. And we've had a couple come through saying, where are they now? There's so many questions coming through. Surveys to suggest that female partners and other senior female lawyers tend to bully young female associates to a much higher degree than young male associates. I've also experienced this on a personal level. What can be done to curtail this type of behavior? I think we probably don't have enough time to go into the details of who does the bullying. But I think if we come back to, Jeff, what you were talking about maladaptive tendencies, is that, you know, perhaps being controversial, bullying is not my area of expertise, but is it perhaps that actually it's negative coping mechanism? Is bullying perhaps partly, not always, because again, it's such a spectrum, but perhaps could that be to do with the culture or to do with how people are coping, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think that the best advice I could give to anybody when they're being bullied is to, one, try to separate themselves from the situation, but two, recognize that that's that person's problem. Like the person displaying anger and being sharp or however they're talking to you, that in the moment, rather than being sure not that to kind of get into that self-blame story that I deserve this, or this is fair, or it's okay. It's just kind of, you don't necessarily need to be that person's therapist and try to say, this is why you're going through it. But I would say recognizing in the moment, that is that person's problem. They're acting in a way that is unprofessional, and it's because they have something that they're dealing with. And you do not need to take that on and not need to blame yourself for that stuff. I would be the first thing that I would say to that.
Yeah, thank you. And Elizabeth, you must get lots of calls, I assume, coming through on the helpline about bullying. Is there some advice that you give out to people when they're calling?
It is a strong theme of calls to our support services. I think bullying and harassment are second or third most common reason people contact us. Also supported by our life in the law research, almost 22% of people who completed the survey had experienced bullying, harassment, or discrimination. I think the challenge is, you know, we're starting to begin to talk about culture, is that it's actually very difficult in practice to call this behavior out. And I think we need to better equip people to feel confident to challenge behavior, but equally, workplaces need to be doing something about it. What I think traditionally has happened is if you report poor behavior in the workplace, it tends to not be dealt with very well. Often it's the person who reported the behavior is the one that lands up leaving. I think that might be beginning to change, But the challenge is that if other people in that organization see that somebody else reported bullying or discrimination and nothing was done about it, they're going to think, well, what's the point of me bringing it up, because nothing's going to change. I'm just going to leave. And I think that, you know, when we're talking about the culture in law, we're talking about all the bad stuff today, and the narrative is so negative. And I've got a current obsession at the moment, which started last week, is looking at all these social media memes, primarily aimed at junior lawyers on Instagram by Legal Cheek and a whole range of organizations. You go and have a look at them. They're practically all negative about how bad life is for a junior lawyer. And I think that is the challenge to us, is we need, I know people want to make jokes and be humorous and all the rest of it, but I think we need to flip that narrative. And, you know, it's quite disappointing to see the poll from people in this webinar, most of them saying they wouldn't be a lawyer again. And I think we need to flip that and make the law seen as this rewarding place to work. You can't buy your way out of the mental health challenges, which is what we're seeing in the legal big law firms in London. You can't just offer people more money and think, oh, well, we don't have to worry about their well-being, because young people are looking at all of this social media stuff and they're thinking, I ain't going to work in the law. This looks like a really bad profession. And so we've got to start. And I think flipping that to speaking about the more positive aspects of law in terms of its rewarding work, the opportunity to solve problems and the intellectual stimulation that comes with it, working with people. But in order to do that, we've really got to work on this culture that we all put up with and accept, which actually, when you take a step back, I mean, I was horrified by your story, Jeff, about, you know, your colleague being impressed by a law firm where someone's missing their child's birthday. You know, I mean, it's corny, but it's true. No one dies and has on their headstone, I wish I spent more time at work. That's not what people say. And there's been quite a lot of research done on people at end of life who are dying, asking about the things that made them happy in life and what their regrets are. And they all say, I wish I'd spent more time with my family and friends. I wish it was all about that connection with other people. And somehow we've got to try and help. You know, I think we're preaching to the converted probably in this audience, is how we get that message out to that wider diaspora of people that really need to hear this and get it. Because the challenge we face ultimately, particularly in this post-COVID times we're moving into, we are not going to attract a wide range of people into our profession, and we're not going to keep them because they're going to leave. And that's what's beginning to happen already.
I'd just add to that, if I may, that in all of our survey results, which after all is empirical evidence, and lawyers love to have evidence of what's going on out there, are, notwithstanding what employers are doing, whether there's a bullying and harassment question or whether there's a mental wellbeing question, that the employees don't think it's enough. They, 70% do not feel that their employer's response is good enough when it comes to bullying and sexual harassment. They don't see sanctions, they don't see change. And of course, we know that's a generic figure because there's a spectrum of bullying. But even so, you want to feel people are going into a workplace where they're at least psychologically able to operate safely and be there, feeling supported by people around them, particularly their management, and also trusted and given some autonomy, because we know that feeds into people's mental well-being. Having levels of autonomy, but also levels of support, is critical to how people can then fare within their work environment. And I think there are lots of strands to this. This is not a kind of simple set of solutions. It's very nuanced, but it is something that we need to see really kind of happening from inside the firms and inside their cultural adaptation process, which is a big ask for some of these entities, but we need to try.
Thank you.
It all sounds like to me like it's the point that you were making earlier, that there really needs to be a leadership overlay in all of it, right? Like even who gets promoted, who gets paid well. If those people who fall in those categories, you're going to be setting up a culture and a set of examples and norms that are okay. Like it's, I'm hopeful from the poll results that times are changing, and I do think that theory around leadership is changing. Hopefully, the law firms aren't last to the game, but I see it happening in our organization and in organizations that we own. That they're written into the values of our organization. One of the 5 values says, "I won't hide my imperfections or my vulnerabilities." That would never be the case 10 years ago. People wouldn't put that in the values of a company. And I didn't write that. Our CEO put that in there.
Thank you. And on that note, we've actually come to the end of our time. This has been fantastic, and thank you so much to the audience as well. I can see that there were 18 questions that came through, which is a lot, and comments, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. We'll look at them afterwards, and we'll make sure. And anybody who wants to contact anyone on the panel, please do that. Any of the LawCare documents, or any of the talks, or any of the podcasts that any of us have mentioned today, I'll make sure I'll gather those all up, and I'll send them around to everybody. But I think this was the 5th discussion that we've had here, and Jeff, you've been along for the ride for all of those. So I really hope that we can keep this going, and I think we're all doing our bit. Obviously, the people who've turned up today are doing their bit. So I think let's all keep going, because this is a sector that's amazing, and we certainly want this sector to not just survive but thrive, and we want people's well-being to be much better than it is, and to be looked after, to feel happy and positive and full of purpose. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you everybody for turning up, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.